All right, we're going to start recording. Ready? I think that's recording.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi class, this is Dr. Maxfield DiCarlo. We are back again for another edition of our Into the Community. So today we are here with Pastor Norm, who is a United Methodist minister at a church here in Havre de Grace, Maryland. And he's going to be talking to us a little bit about his experiences in working in his profession and as interfacing with folks who are dying and who are facing death and bereaved. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
It's wonderful to have you. So just tell us, give everybody sort of a framework. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how that interfaces with people who are experiencing loss or anticipating experiencing loss.
So one of the things that I do is work with a family often before death, so in the dying process.
Okay.
Another thing I do, of course, after there's been a death is plan a funeral, memorial service, celebration of life, celebration of resurrection. So prior to death, I may not be involved. That is also something that happens. But often I'm involved working with the person who's dying, providing pastoral support, prayer, a presence there, a presence to them and a presence to the family. And one of the questions I often have to ask myself in that situation is, who is the client? Whose needs am I working to meet? Is it the person who's dying, or is it the family that's going to be left behind? And sometimes those dovetail nicely, and sometimes they don't. So that is one challenge. So my role is essentially a spiritual one, helping people to frame things through the lens of belief in Jesus Christ. As a United Methodist pastor, that's the lens through which I see life and reality, and death is, of course, a part of life and part of reality. The other aspect I would lift up as far as a pastor goes, as a Christian pastor, is that we view death as not the end. And that's a little bit of a struggle because in the past, Christians have been accused of being deniers of death, that we're just in denial. Because we talk about eternal life and life after death and life after life and all these different phrases. And the current liturgy that we use in the United Methodist Church begins actually with an acknowledgement of the pain and grief and loss, the reality of death. But then we go on from there to talk about resurrection, and to talk about hope. And, of course, different people in different traditions think of resurrection differently, and that's a whole area unto itself. What is resurrection? And what shape does that take? So part of the process in the planning of a memorial service, or a funeral, or a celebration of life and resurrection is, how are the people left behind? What's their frame of reference for that?
Yeah, I love the terms, the different terms that you're using, because it can be different for so many different groups and cultures. Celebration of life is very different than just maybe a funeral, and using those terms to describe what your role is in planning those are really interesting and very unique to the person. When you go into a hospital, what is your role if you're intervening at the point where someone is actually dying, and you go into the hospital? I imagine the hospitals have chaplains and they have people there, but you come in as a support to the family. What does that look like? What are you actually doing while you're there?
So if I'm called to a hospital, presumably there's some connection with the family or the person who's dying. Okay. Otherwise, I wouldn't be there appropriately. So I can't just show up at some random hospital room without a call, without an invitation. So I'm entering into this situation where death is occurring, and I'm going to offer prayer and support. And what I'm doing there, it seems to me, is helping people to do several things. I'm helping people to take leave of one another. Depending on whether the patient, for instance, is conscious, I'm going to encourage them to say what they want to say. If they're not, and even if they are, I'm going to encourage those around to say what they need to say. I'm also going to lift everything up in prayer to God, because my presence, I've been invited there as a representative of the church. So in a sense, I'm representing God, the presence of God and Jesus Christ there in the room. That's why they've called me. There's some faith perspective. So those are the things I would focus on, is framing it for people to say what they need to say, and to lift that all up in prayer, to be a presence. And sometimes that involves touch, hugs, or just holding hands, or whatever it is. But primarily that's what I'd be doing in that setting.
So you walk into a room and it's really emotionally charged, right?
Yes.
This is one of the most vulnerable times in many people's lives. And I can only imagine, you walk out of there, right, having been involved with such an intense situation. How do you take care of yourself? Or is that just easy? Is that just natural for you? Or how do you attend to having been in such an emotionally charged situation and then stepping out of it and this isn't my loss? So how do you sort of negotiate that?
That's a really good question. So longer term, a lot of pastors, at least in my tradition, we meet in collegial groups. And we often call them study groups, but the truth is that we often set aside what we're studying to just deal with each other's emotional needs and hear the stories. So that's one level. We are encouraged to get into counseling if we need it, pastoral counseling, or just counseling, just to process our own grief and our own needs. The other thing I learned early on is to just allow myself to be tired. That after I've left that setting, that I know I'm going to be tired. And to do the things we should all do, which is attend to our nutrition and our sleep and our rest. And I learned early on too, many of us, just after seminary, we found we got sick after we did a funeral.
Stress response.
Stress response.
Yeah.
Of course, we're also dealing with a lot of people who are weeping, so there's a lot of sharing of germs that way too. But yeah, there's a stress response. Those are the ways I think of in terms of self-care.
Those are probably good for all of us that work in this field in general. I know this is, I could sit here all day and just talk with you about this topic because it's so wonderful to get a different perspective. But thank you so much for sort of sharing what you do and how you kind of cope with that. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.